Right, so welcome back. Last week I spoke about American biologist Annie Morrell Smith, and so today I will be talking a bit about the second botanist that I mentioned during Elizabeth Britton's presentation, Delia West Marble. So sadly, we don't have any specimens collected by Delia Marble here at the Tennessee Herbarium, at least nothing that has been digitized yet. Luckily, there are some of her specimens in the portals from other herbaria. So this moss specimen was collected or is housed at the University of Cincinnati. It was collected by Marble in 1909 in Bermuda. But this specimen does not actually have an internal image. So I wasn't able to find any bryophytes that had specimen pictures yet. So I had better luck actually with the lichen portal. So this specimen was collected by Delia Marble along with, you can see, Elizabeth Britton. And they collected it in September of 1906 on an exploration of Jamaica for the New York Botanical Garden in Cockpit Country, on a trip to Troy. So Cockpit Country is a region here on the country of Jamaica. It's marked by steep-sided hollows separated by hills and ridges. And it was actually a place of refuge for the Jamaican Maroons who were fleeing slavery during the late 17th century up into the mid 1800s. And they're a unique cultural group today in Jamaica. And you can see the town of Troy, it's down here. So somewhere in this area is where they were collecting this lichen. So the species is listed as Graphis apzelii, which is a synonym of Diplolabia apzelii. It's a script lichen, and which refers to the fact that it almost looks a little bit kind of like handwritten or hand-drawn characters. It usually grows on smooth bark, the smooth bark of trees. And on the right, you can see these are some recent pictures of it from Florida. And I thought it kind of almost looked like chromosomes almost on this tree, which I thought was interesting. So Delia West Marble was born in 1868 in New York City. Her father was Manton Marble, and he was a well-known publisher and editor of the New York World. And her mother was also named Delia West Marble, so she was named after her mom. And I could not find any information about her education, but it seems like she came from a pretty wealthy background. So she was able to spend her time on a number of worthy causes, both botanical and otherwise. The first mention I found was her joining the Tory Botanical Society, which we've mentioned before. She was elected an active member in 1891. In 1901, she served as secretary pro tem, which basically means she was holding the position temporarily in the absence of its official secretary. And from 1902 to at least 1905, she served on the club's committee on admissions. She was also involved in a number of collecting expeditions with Elizabeth and Nathaniel Britton, who we've discussed before. They were married botanists who helped create and work for the New York Botanical Garden. And I'm not sure if the three met in the Tory Botanical Club or if they knew each other beforehand. But in February of 1906, she accompanied the Brittons for a few weeks of collecting in Puerto Rico, including the Isle of Culebra, which is here off the East Coast. In April of 1906, a party including Marble and the Brittons traveled through the mountains of Puerto Rico, bringing back 1,700 plant specimens, along with a large number of living plants for the conservatories at the Botanical Garden. And it's not really clear if this was one big trip or two consecutive trips. I couldn't really tell. In August of that same year, they all sailed to Jamaica for a month of botanical exploration among the mountains on the island. And if you remember our lichen label, from September of 1906, it would have been collected by Delia and Elizabeth during this trip. In February of 1913, she collected mosses with Elizabeth Britton for 4 weeks on the island of St. Thomas. They collected 70 packets of 28 species, including 3 new species. And I found another note about a specimen of Sclerocarpus africanus, which is a plant in the aster family that she collected with the Brittons on that same trip. And I thought another interesting note is that at this time, St. Thomas was part of the Danish West Indies, but the US actually bought the islands in 1917 for $25 million in gold, which is apparently over $500 million today. And so St. Thomas is now part of the US Virgin Islands. So they were also back collecting in Puerto Rico in 1913. So there's a reference to a peculiar specimen collected by Nathaniel and Delia of freshwater cladophora, which is a kind of green algae. So these may have not been her only trips, but they're the ones that I was able to find, largely by looking in the bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Garden or Torrey Botanic Society. And each edition has a section, news items, which describes events and activities and trips of the members, which is kind of interesting to read through. And that's where I got a lot of this information. So Marble spent most of her life in Bedford, New York, and was an active member in a number of organizations, so not just botanical ones. Starting in 1898, she was a charter member of the District Nursing Association of Northern Westchester County. She was their active director for its first 50 years, its first secretary serving for 20 years, and she also served as president and was an honorary president up until her death. In 1911, she was one of 20 friends who formed the Bedford Garden Club to stimulate knowledge and love of gardening among amateurs, to aid in the protection of native plants and birds, and to encourage civic planting and conservation. And she's listed in the history on their website as one of 2 pioneers who led the way, with a Miss Eloise Lecour, who was a botanist and artist. And Marble served terms as both chairman of its conservation committee and its president. In 1916, she's listed as a member of the executive committee for the Wildflower Preservation Society of America, and one of that organization's founders was Elizabeth Britton. And she also helped to start the Rippewam School in Bedford, which opened in 1917. It was originally a girls' school, but became co-ed in 1920, and still exists today as a private school. And she also served on its board. So another really interesting group she was involved with during World War I was the Women's Land Army of America, if you're not familiar with that. So during the war, a lot of working age men were obviously overseas serving in the military, and that left a lot of open jobs without men to fill them. And a lot of us are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, so women who went to work in factories and construction jobs, but there was also a real shortage of farm laborers. So some women took the initiative to see if they could help to fill the need for those types of jobs as well. And there's a lot of information and pictures I got from this book, Fruits of Victory, The Women's Land Army of America in the Great War by Elaine F. Weiss. So I'd recommend checking it out, or another book like it on the subject if you're interested. So one of the first attempts was a women's agricultural camp set up in Bedford, New York, so right where Marble was living. Her garden club was interested in looking for ways to help the war effort, so she was deputized by them to offer their resources. And the woman in charge of the project put her in touch with Ida H. Ogilvy. I really don't know how to pronounce her name, so I apologize in advance. Ogilvy, who was a geology professor and whose experience working out in the field they thought would be helpful for the project. So I could give a whole talk about this woman, but she's not a botanist, so I'll try to keep it brief. So she was born in 1874 and pretty much grew up in the outdoors. Her father was a landscape painter and her mother was also an artist. They sent her to Europe as a child to publish her rough edges, and she came back speaking better French than English. Unlike her parents, she chose to study the sciences instead of art. She majored in zoology and geology at Bryn Mawr College, studying with Florence Bascom, who was the first American woman to be a professional geologist. She did some graduate work at the University of Chicago, and then ended up getting her doctorate from Columbia University in 1903. She became a professor at Barnard College, which is a women's college affiliated with Columbia University. And while there, she established and led their geology department. And for decades, it was ran as a women's only department with an all-female faculty and staff to provide role models for their students. And she also taught geology classes at Columbia University. So Ogilvy invited Marble to her office to discuss farm work for women. And that began a partnership that would be both professional and romantic, and would last for the rest of their lives. So Marble had a family farm, and she provided some of that space for additional training camp acreage, and Ogilvy became the camp director. So the Women's Agricultural Camp opened in June of 1917. Its first season included 142 women. up to 73 of them living on site at the camp, ranging in age from 16 to 45. 6 were married, 60 were college students or graduates, many from Berner College. Another contingent came from the Manhattan Trade School, and they had been working as factory seamstresses. But there were others were teachers, professors, secretaries, chauffeurs, concert singers, florists, designers, governesses, and one had been a news reporter. So a big range of backgrounds. Typically, they would train for a week or two, working in the camp garden to learn techniques and also to build up their muscles. They were sent out to work in squads for local farmers. They were paid the rate, the farmers paid the camp the going rate for male laborers, which was 25 cents an hour or $2 a day. And the women were adamant that they didn't want to undercut the cost of mill workers, so they insisted on those wages. And the women themselves received $15 a month plus room and board. And Ogilvy approached running the camp very scientifically, so she used trial and error to increase their efficiency. Not unexpectedly, the farmers were very skeptical at first. So women dressed in men's overalls were quite shocking. They doubted if women, many of them city girls, would be able to do the physical work. But as mill help became more and more scarce, demand increased. One source says, slowly, one by one, farmers began to inquire about getting a gang of those girls over to their place just to try them out. And by mid-July that year, they couldn't keep up with the demand. So they dispatched 60 women each day and could have used at least 50 more. They were christened the farmerettes, were employed by 99 different farmers in the area. So the Bedford Farmers Club gave emphatic testimony as to the efficiency of their labor, their market intelligence, their eagerness to learn the reason why of agricultural operations, their zest and steadfastness, and their pleasant and unexceptional demeanor. The unanimous verdict of the farmers was that while less strong than men, they more than made up for this by superior conscientiousness and quickness. So a Continental Congress of Women's Land Service was held in December of 1917. Marble attended as a representative of the Garden Club. And the attendees agreed to officially form the Women's Land Army of America. In February of 1918, Marble went to Washington to lobby the USDA for official status and support, but they were given a runaround. So it said the official Washington attitude was that these women in khaki overalls and bloomers had not been asked to help in the fields. It was not their place. They were not needed, and they were a nuisance. So the majority of officials believed women should take jobs in the city, and then the men who were working those jobs could go and work in the fields. But they carried on anyway. So in 1918, they recruited 150 students at Barnard College. They actually offered a farmers preparedness course during the semester, where they would meet in the gymnasium to train the large and unused muscle groups to be used in hoeing, haying, etc. The 1818 season included 434 women at the Bedford camp, and several of the alumni from 1917 were sent to lead new Land Army units in Georgia, Rhode Island, and Ohio. Marble started the newspaper, the Farmerette, including articles and photographs from their work, and she leased rooms for a clubhouse in Manhattan where they could meet up socially. Marble also spoke in favor of the women's agricultural camp at the Torrey Botanical Club meeting as well in 1918. In 1919, Marble and Ogilvy went on a tour of the Western states to encourage chapters of the Women's Land Army in that region, and a number of additional units were established. But ultimately, funding issues and apparently a feud with the YMCA ended the formal project that year. So their efforts were eventually recognized and thanked by the government, but they never received any funding. So it was supported solely by donations and the women and people involved. And Marble and Ogilvy received a nominal $1 a year salary for their work. So the pair continued to operate Marble's family farm, which was called Arley, with only women workers, including some from the Land Army for the next 30 years. And Ogilvy purchased an additional dairy farm called the Hermitage. Marble became curator of the geology collections at Barnard College and Columbia University, working closely with Ogilvy every day. I found this really nice story in Ida's obituary, so I'll read it. It says, Miss Marble was a close friend of Miss Ogilvy's from the time of the First World War, when both had been involved in the Women's Land Army, an agricultural group of which more will be said later. She was considerably older than Miss Ogilvy, unusually short, tanned, and wrinkled from outdoor living on a farm at Bedford, New York, on which she and Miss Ogilvy spent long weekends. She had a gracious friendliness that endeared her to all the Bernard geology students. With incredible strength for one of her advanced years and small stature, she would transfer trays of rocks and minerals as needed, climbing high on a ladder into this tiny storage room with its one glaring bare light bulb, like a snow-capped gnome in a cave. So quite a nice picture. So obviously they worked together and lived together, but in that era, their public relationship was officially classified as just a close friendship. In 1948, Marble is listed as a life member of the Torrey Botanical Society, so she was obviously still involved in the botanical community. And she passed away in 1951 after a long illness at the age of 83. In 1942, she had received the Garden Club of America's Medal for Distinguished Service. The Bedford Garden Club created a wildflower garden in 1955 in honor of Marble and its other co-founders. And in 2022, it was restored to include hundreds of native plants. There are 88 specimens collected by Marble in the Bradford portal, 64 lichens, and 155 vascular specimens. Most of these are from those trips she took with the Brittons to the Caribbean, but there are a couple from Bedford, New York in 1888 and 1889, so around the time she was joining the Botanical Society. And there's one from the edge of the Grand Canyon in 1919. So I'm wondering if she collected that during that trip out west with Ida. So that is Delia West Marble, not exactly a prolific botanist or collector, but still a really interesting person who contributed to some great causes during her life. So thanks again for listening.